There's something about betrayal that cuts deeper when it comes from someone who's been there since the beginning. Bonpensiero wasn't just another soldier in Tony's crew. He was a founding piece of the Soprano crew's early identity. He was loyal, steady, and part of Tony's inner circle long before the money or the influence grew. So when the show later reveals that Bonpensiero had flipped for the FBI, the impact goes far beyond shock. It isn't just that someone snitched. It's that someone from within the heart of the family quietly tore a hole in its fabric. To understand what Bonpensiero told the FBI, you have to first look at the timeline of his cooperation. Puss begins working as an informant sometime between the end of Season 1 and the early parts of Season 2, though it's implied that he might have been approached by the Bureau before that. The feds knew he was vulnerable. He had a heroin distribution charge hanging over his head, and with that came the kind of federal time that would end his life. In the mob world, that's the perfect setup for a flip. Bonpensiero had a family, a business, and a life that he wasn't ready to lose. He wasn't the kind of guy who could handle prison, not like Paulie or Silvio. The FBI saw that, and they leveraged it. The first thing Puss provided the FBI was information on Tony's operations, who ran what, how the hierarchy worked, and where the money flowed. While he was no boss, Bonpensiero was close enough to Tony to have a clear picture of the structure. He identified soldiers, associates, and go-betweens. He confirmed Tony's role as acting boss while Junior held the title. And in doing so, he gave the Bureau a functional roadmap of how the family actually operated day to day. From a law enforcement perspective, that was gold. The FBI had been struggling to understand the Sopranos because the power dynamic between Tony and Junior was murky. Bonpensiero's intel clarified that. He explained that while Junior was the nominal boss, Tony was the one everyone actually answered to. He gave them insight into how Tony used his waste management business as a front. He also detailed the various small scams and rackets that kept the family running, from construction kickbacks to loan sharking and stolen goods. It wasn't a single revelation that brought Tony down, but the pattern Puss helped outline, gave the feds something they'd been lacking: structure. But what Bonpensiero didn't know was that the FBI rarely values loyalty in return. They promise protection and leniency, but what they really wanted was access. They bugged him, they wired him up, and they sent him into rooms he'd been in hundreds of times before, only now with a recorder in his pocket. He was instructed to gather evidence that could tie Tony directly to criminal activity, especially acts of violence or organized extortion. The Bureau knew that without something concrete, Tony's position was still safe. They needed recordings, admissions, anything that could prove racketeering or murder conspiracies. Throughout Season 2, you can see the slow breakdown of Puss's composure. He tries to balance both worlds, the criminal one he grew up in and the federal one he's been forced into. And that tension shows through every time he's around Tony. The problem is that Tony's paranoia grows alongside Puss's guilt. Even before Tony knows for sure, he feels it. He can sense that something about Bonpensiero's behavior has shifted. The small hesitations, the forced laughs, the new distance in conversations. While working with the FBI, Bonpensiero specifically gave up information about Tony's financial dealings. He identified the front businesses used to launder money, such as the Bada Bing and Satrials. He also mentioned the involvement of key associates like Christopher Moltisanti, Paulie Gualtieri, and Silvio Dante in Tony's various schemes. Though he may not have given up detailed incriminating evidence against all of them, even partial information was enough to let the Bureau start connecting dots. The feds already had wiretaps and surveillance on the family, but they lacked inside context. Puss filled in those blanks, explaining who was who and what roles they played in specific jobs. He also passed along intel about upcoming meetings and gatherings, which helped the FBI understand Tony's movements. There were times when the Bureau used Bonpensiero's tips to stake out Satrials or the Bing, hoping to capture incriminating interactions. But Puss often failed to deliver the level of cooperation the feds expected. He wasn't feeding them major secrets about murders or direct orders from Tony, partly because he knew that going that far would sign his death warrant. He walked a tight line, trying to keep the FBI satisfied while not giving away enough to get himself killed if Tony ever found out. That's what makes his betrayal more tragic than malicious. Bonpensiero wasn't driven by greed or ego. He was cornered. The Bureau had him on a heroin case, and the choice was prison or cooperation. He likely believed he could play both sides, feed the FBI just enough to survive, and maybe the problem would go away. But in this world, once you become a rat, you can't undo it. From Tony's perspective, the ripple effect of Puss's betrayal was immense. The moment Tony suspected him, the foundation of trust within the family began to rot. Even before confirmation, Tony started questioning everyone's loyalty. He became more paranoid, more defensive, and more detached. The structure of a crime family depends on loyalty, not just professional, but emotional. You have to believe that the man sitting next to you isn't secretly wearing a wire. Bonpensiero's betrayal cracked that belief. It wasn't just the FBI infiltrating the family, it was the emotional infection of mistrust spreading through it. When Tony eventually confirms that Puss flipped, it's not because of the FBI directly. It's through subtle signs, inconsistencies, and the lingering feeling that the man he once trusted is no longer the same. The confrontation that follows isn't just an execution, it's an autopsy of friendship. By the time Bonpensiero confesses on the boat, the damage is irreversible. Even if he hadn't said another word to the FBI, the bond was dead the moment he started working with them. In terms of the broader family structure, Puss's cooperation gave the FBI a blueprint of the Soprano crew's operations. He helped them understand that Tony's leadership wasn't chaotic, it was organized, strategic, and effective. That realization made Tony a bigger target in the Bureau's eyes. Before Bonpensiero flipped, Tony was seen as a mid-level figure, a glorified captain in a larger family. After Puss, the feds knew Tony was effectively running North Jersey. He also contributed indirectly to new surveillance efforts. Because of his information, the FBI shifted resources toward Tony's inner circle. They began monitoring his meetings with Junior, his therapy sessions with Dr. Melfi, and his family gatherings. In a way, Puss's cooperation initiated the long campaign of observation that defined Tony's storyline in later seasons. The FBI's focus on Tony's domestic and psychological life, the things that made him vulnerable, came from an understanding that Bonpensiero's betrayal helped unlock. Still, there's a debate over how much actionable evidence Puss actually gave them. In real mob terms, informants like Bonpensiero are often used for corroboration. They confirm what wiretaps or surveillance already suggest. They rarely hand over hard proof on their own because they know doing so would destroy their standing completely. In Puss's case, his cooperation seemed to plateau. The FBI grew frustrated with his limited progress, but they kept him around because he still had access to Tony. Psychologically, Puss's role as an informant turned him into something the show does better than almost any other, a symbol. He represents what happens when loyalty collides with survival. Every mobster in the show claims that being a rat is the ultimate betrayal, but the reality is that many of them live in constant fear of becoming one. Bonpensiero simply broke first. His conscience and his fear of death outweighed his code. And while Tony eventually kills him for it, the emotional consequence of that act is permanent. After Puss's death, you can feel his absence like a ghost that never leaves. The crew becomes colder, more paranoid. Tony loses a piece of himself in that moment. Not just a friend, but a part of his own innocence, the last trace of loyalty from the old days. The world that once felt built on honor and hierarchy now feels built on suspicion and lies. Every man in the crew begins to question who's next. That's the real consequence of Bonpensiero's betrayal. Not the FBI files, not the recordings, but the erosion of belief. Looking at the FBI side again, they would have documented Puss's cooperation in several ways. Debriefing reports, field notes, and potentially surveillance summaries. While The Sopranos never explicitly shows every detail of what he gave up, the implications are clear. He identified members, explained operations, and gave law enforcement a way to understand Tony's structure. That knowledge in the real world is the foundation of a RICO case. It's what prosecutors use to link individuals under one criminal enterprise. Bonpensiero may not have seen it that way, but he effectively handed them the first few puzzle pieces they'd need. The other key piece of information Puss gave was context on Junior's organization and his relationship with Tony. Early on, the FBI was confused about who held real power in the family. Bonpensiero helped clarify that Tony, though technically under Junior, was running much of the day-to-day business. That insight was huge. It allowed the FBI to refocus its investigations around Tony's operations rather than Junior's outdated crew. It's one of the reasons Tony's family becomes the Bureau's long-term obsession across the rest of the series. But Puss also gave the FBI a cultural education. Something more subtle, but equally valuable. He explained how Tony operated not just as a mobster, but as a leader. He described how Tony used psychology, manipulation, and even empathy to control his men. That kind of inside perspective gave the FBI a psychological profile they could use to predict Tony's moves. They began to see him not just as a criminal, but as a conflicted, emotionally driven man. Ironically, that understanding might have been part of why they never fully caught him. Tony's unpredictability was rooted in emotion, not logic, and the Bureau never learned how to fight that. From a purely factual standpoint, Bonpensiero's cooperation yielded the following key pieces of information. Identification of Tony Soprano as the true acting boss of the family. Names and roles of high-ranking members like Silvio Dante, Paulie Gualtieri, and Christopher Moltisanti. Details about money laundering fronts. Bada Bing, Satrial's pork store. Barone Sanitation. Information about certain criminal enterprises. Car thefts, construction scams, and loans harking operations. Scheduling and context for meetings that the FBI could later surveil. Clarification of the power structure and the tension between Tony and Junior. This kind of information may seem basic, but it was enough to tighten the Bureau's circle around Tony. It gave them a framework they could cross-check with wiretaps, financial audits, and future informants. In real organized crime cases, that groundwork often leads to long-term investigations that span years. Exactly what happens in The Sopranos. The aftermath of Puss's betrayal plays out not just as a story of justice, but as a study of corrosion. The family never truly recovers from it. Once trust is broken at that level, it can't be rebuilt. Tony's later decisions, who he promotes, who he isolates, who he kills, all carry the echo of what happened with Bonpensiero. He becomes more careful, more suspicious, and more brutal. He stops trusting instinct the way he used to, and that costs him pieces of his humanity over time. What's interesting is that Puss's cooperation didn't even lead to any direct arrests. The FBI never used his recordings to bring down Tony. It was the betrayal itself that did the most damage. In that sense, Bonpensiero's usefulness to the FBI was more psychological than legal. He fractured the family from the inside, doing more harm than any wiretap ever could. His betrayal also highlights the theme of inevitability that runs through The Sopranos. Every character faces a breaking point, a moment where self-preservation outweighs loyalty, where morality folds under pressure. Puss just reached his first. His cooperation was a desperate attempt to survive in a world that doesn't forgive weakness. But in doing so, he sealed his fate. When Tony, Paulie, and Silvio take him out on the boat, the atmosphere says everything. There's no yelling, no moral speeches, just the quiet understanding that one of their own has crossed the line. Even then, Tony struggles. It's one of the few moments where he feels genuine sadness about what he has to do. Because deep down, Tony knows that killing Bonpensiero isn't just business. It's personal. It's killing the last thread of a friendship that once felt untouchable. After Puss's death, the Soprano family runs colder, but also tighter. Tony's inner circle shrinks. He keeps things closer to his chest, trusts fewer people, and begins relying more on manipulation than camaraderie. The sense of brotherhood that once existed in the early days is gone. In its place is a world where everyone's being watched. By the FBI, by each other, and by their own paranoia. So while Bonpensiero gave the FBI tangible information, names, structure, business details, what he truly gave them was something far greater. Access. Access to the emotional core of the family, to the mind of Tony Soprano, and to the cracks that would define the rest of the series. His betrayal didn't end with his death. It lived on in every suspicious glance, every hesitation, every moment Tony wondered if another friend was lying to him. And that's the real legacy of what Puss told the FBI. Not the facts themselves, but the world of fear they created. A world where loyalty could no longer be assumed, and where every smile might hide a wire. Thank you all for watching. I post Soprano videos every day. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay updated.